Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening, Professor. Good evening, Prof.
All right. I would like to take this opportunity once again to welcome you to our class. And our class is the philosophy of methods. And you know, for quite some good time now, we've been covering a number of things. And my objective today is to ensure that we finalize what we had earlier started. I think for now, around the 3 lectures or 4 lectures, if I'm not mistaken, we've been handling integrating philosophy of science in the PhD proposal. Right. And if you recall, in our first lecture, we did go through what a PhD proposal is all about. We looked at the core questions that we try to answer in a PhD proposal. And these centered around the arguments being raised by Karl Popper, what the problem is, the reality that produces that specific problem, and how we can actually know that reality, and that is real epistemology, and how it can be studied, and what kind of knowledge is actually produced. And all those are very important. And I remember asking you to go and read the book, Conjectures and Refutations by Karl Popper. And I think in tomorrow's lecture, if I'm not mistaken, because we have a class that starts at 8 a.m., I'll be taking you through some of the major principles that Karl Popper actually articulates. But even then, the idea of incorporating philosophy of methods in your entire proposal and PhD thesis is based on the Popperian foundation, so Karl Popper's foundation, who actually articulates that methods follows problems, and you all know that methods come after methodology, and methodology is determined by the philosophy, right? And I think all that is very important. If we understand that knowledge grows through testing, and that is what actually Karl Popper states. And it's always very important to start from the problem, not the philosophy, right, but the problem. And then we proceed and discuss all those things that we are supposed to discuss. So we went through all those things, and I do not have to really spend too much time revisiting those particular aspects, because you are now very familiar with those concepts. So, of course, I also gave you a number of examples. I hope you still remember the examples I gave you and the common mistakes that students usually make when they are actually writing their proposals, right from the introduction, right? And the introduction will ordinarily have a background statement of the problem. And I did tell you that the background statement of the problem must show complexity and justify the philosophical stance. That takes us to possibly the literature, which again has to highlight competing assumptions before we go to methodology, right? But as I said, within the literature, there are so many things that we consider, and those aspects are very important. And I think we went through major concepts, right, that come up in the background. And I wanted us to move to the conceptualization or the conceptual model. And of course, that is where we are going to move to today, right? So allow me to now share my slides, and I think the slides here, let me see. But I don't know whether you have any problem that you would, or question that you'd like to raise before we go to the next component of our lecture, right? Going into the conceptualization or conceptual model, right? And we close that chapter of the proposal today. Now, of course, you are also aware that Makerere University has invited you to attend advanced research methods next week. I think the classes begin on Monday, which is 11th. And I think for all this time, we've been discussing on how we are going to facilitate that particular course. And we finalized it today. Of course, we're aware that some of the days or a day next week, if not two, will be taken as a public holiday, right? And as a result, then we might have to extend those particular topics or modules that are supposed to be covered on that particular date to a later date. So if you have any general question, please ask. And for some of you who did not attend the previous courses at Makerere, because these are cross-cutting courses and these are modules that must be completed. If you are under the cohort system, right, think twice to miss those lectures. But the choice is yours, certainly. At the end of the day, I am not an administrator of Makerere University, not even Makerere University Business School, and I'm not a spokesperson for any of the two. But it will be quite important and useful for you to attend and also do the assessments, the competence-based assessments that will be given to you. Next week, I'll be administering around 2 to 3 competence assessments, generally speaking, centrally at Makerere University. Others will be doing the same, and all those grades will be given to the Directorate of Graduate Training, Makerere University. So that being said, is there anybody who has a question as I try to share my slides here? Let me see where the sharing button is. I think this is the one, if I'm not mistaken. Great. So that is it. Right. Okay. That is it. That is it. Where had we stopped? Right. Is there any person who has an issue? I can see Diaz or Kurut. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening, sir. How are you?
Fine, thank you, Professor. Mine is just a concern. We have been following the communication about the pending lecture, which is starting on Monday.
Yes, please.
And some of us have been raising a concern that is it possible to have a kind of a mixed delivery system for those that can be there physically, and some of us who are caught up with a lot of assignments elsewhere and are really having a challenge to attend this physically, much as would have wanted to attend. But no one has committed themselves to tell us whether a link will be created to that effect. Could you be having an idea about the same?
Well, as I said, I'm not a spokesman of Makerere University. I'm neither spokesman of Makerere University nor spokesman of Makerere University Business School. So I cannot give you an official position, but we discussed it and agreed that the students will be given a link. As to whether the link will be shared, that's a different story, and it is outside my jurisdiction. But I would suggest that you get in contact with Makerere University, Directorate of Graduate Training. They are the ones actually that are coordinating this. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, sir.
That is good enough, Professor. Thanks so much, Professor.
Okay. Any other? I saw 2 hands. There's another person who raised the hand. Okay.
Yes, good evening, Professor.
Good evening,
ladies
how are
and
you?
gentlemen. I'm fine, thank you. My question was just the same, because the course is supposed to be not. We can attend some things, but to miss a whole course because of attendance is a bit bad for me. But I accept your explanation anyway, and thank you.
Okay. And by the way, the assessments will be made instantly. So when you attend, make sure that you attempt the competence-based assignments and activities. So the assessment will be continuous, and do it on a daily basis. If the facilitators allow you, especially those who will be online, to submit your responses on their emails, please do so. Otherwise, you will miss the grading. And today, I think I intentionally sent you a write-up from the graduate training, which indicates the people who are going to receive certificates of, I don't know what they'll call them, but those are the people who actually attended and also did those competence-based exercises that we are given in class. So I would suggest that you try your level best to attend if you can attend. Even some of the things that I've been talking about here, because I think on day 3, if I'm not mistaken, I'll be talking about quantitative studies and paradigms. So meaning that some of the philosophical aspects will be coming in there. But I will not be as detailed as I have been here, because there we've got a very short time, I think about 10 days. And there are a lot of things that we have to cover within that period. And do not forget that we shall be talking to people from various colleges, College of Health Sciences, Natural Sciences, Chemistry, those who come from zoology, those who come from literature, those who come from engineering and things like that. So the language that will be used there is likely to be very general, and probably no one will go into the details of what is supposed to be done within the business context. So my advice that you attend, and these things usually come once in a while, right? They are running this. After this, I think we shall go to philosophy of methods. Then after that, we shall go to scholarly writing and publication and communication skills. And I think there's another course that will be this. There are also some which are electives, right? Like gender and so forth. But some of the things we discussed within the meeting is that usually the attendance for some of those courses is usually very, very low. Many people do not want to attend. But I would suggest that if you get time, you attend all, you lose nothing, right? And attempt a few things here and there. Right. So as I said, I'm not a spokesman of Makerere University, nor am I a spokesman of Makerere University Business School. So do not take me accountable on any statement I've made here. These people in Makerere University and Makerere University Business School, they know very well what they are communicating. Ignore mine. Mine is just advice that it is always very good to attend if you can actually attend. But if you feel that it is not necessary, then do not really attend. But someone is saying leader, so I don't know what that actually means. Are you not hearing me? Hello?
No, we can hear you well.
Right. So I don't know what that one meant in leader. Right. Someone can actually translate. Those are strange tongues, especially around this time. Okay. So we want to move. You are all aware that when you're writing a proposal, usually the first chapter is the introduction. The introduction has so many things. And I'm sure you have met your supervisors. They have told you what is supposed to be there. My job is very simple: to integrate philosophy of science. Then when we meet you next week at Makerere University, starting from Monday, actually on that very day, right, we are going to start with a statement of the problem in the morning. Oh, Then, if not in the morning, then in the afternoon, we shall be talking. I think this afternoon, that very day, we are going to talk about the world of science and new developments. Again, I will be talking about that. Maybe the following day, we shall go into the statement of the problem. Right. I will not facilitate that one, but they will give you the components that constitute a very good statement of the problem. And your job now will be very simple to see how you can integrate philosophy in what they are going to teach you. You know, sometimes we don't have a rubric of how to write those things, but I think to me this is very good. It's even coming at a very right time, integrating philosophy of methods and also the advanced research methods. I know that the focus next week is not on the philosophy of science, so they will be giving you the general things. Then when you go into philosophy of methods later on, these things will be brought up. So that is the introduction. It has so many things, and I think MOOBS has given you a structure to follow. Then after that, you have your chapter 2. Your chapter 2, if you're, by the way, I gave many co-host rights. I gave many of you co-host rights. Please help me and mute those microphones that misbehave, and so that I don't have to pay attention to people who are conducting multiple businesses in the class, right? While they're attending class, they are also bargaining. There is a haggling. And that's what Jesus did one time when he went to the temple and he found many people conducting business. He had to whip them. But for me, I will not do that, right? So when you join, please make sure that your microphones are muted so that even when you have to multitask and do a few other things outside, you do not inconvenience the class, right? So I was talking about literature review. So some of you, your supervisors may ask you to have a section on theoretical review or review of theories, 1 or 2 or 3 that you are going to use. And they may ask you to separate, right? So if they ask you to separate because, well, they have reasons why they think so, please do so. If others, other members or the committee members ask you to mix, right, the empirical and the theoretical review, please do so. So listen to your supervisors because they're the ones who are going to take you through up to the end. For me, I can give you general guidelines, but even then, as I give you general guidelines, please be mindful of the fact that you have a doctoral committee. Right. So if they ask you to have a theoretical, separate it from the empirical, separate it from the policy, right? Because some other supervisors will ask you to review 1 or 2 or 3 policies and then have another section do so. So if they ask you to separate it into 3 sections of literature review, please comply. If they ask you to separate and come up with the 2 where you have policy-oriented and the other one, please comply. Right. That would be really based on the wisdom of your supervisors or doctoral committee members. And I don't want you to begin quoting me and say that, you know, the fellow who taught us philosophy of methods and literature review asked us to do this. Right. It's the same issues we are discussing today in the meeting at Makerere, where, I mean, generally speaking, when we are delivering literature review, we probably focus on the traditional literature review, but we did agree that we should actually extend to the various types of reviews so that the students get to know that you have the state of art review, you have systematic literature review, you have the traditional, you have theoretical, you have policy, you have so many others, right? So that now when you go back and the supervisors talk to you about these things, do not blame them and begin comparing your doctoral committee members with the other students' doctoral committee members. You say mine are very hard, they are more difficult than the other ones. No, it's a choice that the supervisors make at that level. So I think that will be very clear to you, and you should know how to treat this. So that was literature review, right? But even after literature review, you go to the next section, which is methodology. And after methodology, of course, you begin with those major philosophical issues. You go to research design, right? And then come down, right, into methods. Then you go into the analysis. Again, we have philosophy. So the component we are talking about now, which is conceptual framework, is usually part, right, of either chapter 1, again, depending on your supervisors and the structure that the university gives you. At Makerere University, it is in chapter 1, right? In other universities, it is in chapter 2, literature review, right? Or you have the theoretical review. Then within the theoretical review, you end up with a section, if it is not integrated within your work, which we call theoretical stroke conceptual frameworks. Again, with the time, if I'm given the opportunity to come back and facilitate advanced research methods, assuming that there will be another opportunity at MOOCs, then we shall see the difference between theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks. I know many times we tend to confuse these two, but there's a difference between them, and there's also a reason why we usually call this theoretical stroke conceptual framework, right, within your literature there. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is how we are going to move. And today we are looking at conceptual framework. Now, of course, we are going to deal with those 3 major bullets that you see, and of course, a few others that will come on later on. So that is our conceptual framework. And looking at it from the philosophical perspective, ladies and gentlemen, this is actually how you structure reality, right? So we are moving into a section where many doctoral proposals look impressive on the surface, but sometimes collapse under scrutiny, right? Because the students fail to understand what a conceptual or theoretical framework is all about. So the conceptual framework, ladies and gentlemen, according to students, and most of the time, right, students often treat it, right, as a diagram to be drawn. And that is a very big mistake, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at it in terms of a diagram and you start drawing diagrams, then you have a very big problem. Now, this slide that we are dealing with, right, which is a conceptual framework, is not about drawing diagrams or even those boxes which are connected by arrows. That is not the major purpose. It's about answering a much deeper question, right? And that question is, how do you conceptualize reality? Remember, that's where we started from. But now you move into the conceptualization. Again, next week, I'll be having a session on the conceptualization and the operationalization, right, before moving into paradigms. And that is really a philosophical question, and it's not a cosmetic question. So what you are doing in this section, ladies and gentlemen, is translating everything you have argued so far. That is your problem, a statement of the problem, your critique of literature, your theoretical positioning into a structured representation of reality, right? In other words, here you are saying that this is how I believe the key elements of this problem exist, and this is how they relate to each other. For some of you who may have listened to my lectures in the philosophy of science and economics, you may have heard me talk about different types of conceptual frameworks and theoretical frameworks, right? Moving from the mathematical concepts to the demand Caesar diagrams, where you start talking about the demand function and the supply function, or the law of demand and the law of supply, into something that is more structured. And going into those diagrams that you have in the decision science, where you have those particular boxes, right, that look a little bit different from the ones that you've been drawing, and then going into the area of what we call the computer science, where you start looking at those ontological diagrams that again that are structured a little bit different or differently from the way we've been presenting our issues this other side. So that's why I'm saying that at this stage, you present what we call your theoretical positioning, of course, after moving from the statement of the problem, the critique of literature, you present that into a structured representation of reality, and that is your theoretical and conceptual model. So in other words, you are saying this is how I believe that the key elements of this problem exist, and this is my belief of how these actually relate to each other. So if your earlier sections, ladies and gentlemen, about the statement of the problem or the problem itself, and of course, moving from there to the literature review, if those sections were weak, then this section will expose it immediately, because here you cannot hide behind words, You must show clarity of thinking, and this is very important. So what I'm going to do right now, ladies and gentlemen, is to take you to our third bullet there, and that is how we actually break down, the requirements. We try to break down the requirements of the conceptual model and theoretical model, because each one, is non-negotiable, as you see it in those dashes that we have, the variables that must be conceptually defined. So this is where many students actually fail, So a variable in this case is not just a name, As I said earlier on, we start with the concepts, and the concept is abstract, So when we go to a variable, we are simply saying that it is a concept with a meaning that is grounded in theory. So for example, if you say that I have a concept that I'm going to study, which is institutional quality, You must answer that. What does this actually mean when we say that we are dealing with institutional quality? Are you talking about regulatory consistency? Because if you go through literature, again, depending on the discipline where you are coming from, you'll find that institutional quality can be represented by regulatory consistency, and there's nothing wrong with that, Now, in other literature, they'll be talking about enforcement capacity, for example, Now, again, when you dig deeper, you might be talking about transparency or procedures. So again, it's very important here that every concept that you use, later on is turned into a variable, And this box of yours, or this conceptual framework that you are representing, which is a representation of reality, a representation of the problem, because the criterion variable, which is your dependent variable, must represent the problem or the research question, the major research question that you are trying to answer. So it is very important for you to know where you are coming from and where you are going, because if you do not define it conceptually, then your study becomes ambiguous, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why I've been very direct to you throughout the previous lectures, and articulating these things, in a way that can easily be understood. Because if two readers, that pick your proposal, or the reviewers, or even the examiners, if there are two or three, like in our case, we have, I think, 3 examiners. One is an external examiner and 2 internal examiners, And then we have the other policy fellow who will come in to interrogate you on issues of policy. And then you also have others and members of the public. Now, if 2 or 3 or more people interpret your variable differently, then you have not defined it properly in your work. So this is very, very, very important. Variables must be conceptually defined. Now, the second requirement that you see there is that variables must be theoretically grounded. And this is where you connect your variables to a theory, These variables must be having their origin right, must be having somewhere. So that's why your conceptual theoretical model must be grounded in theory, right? Otherwise, it's not a matter of drawing boxes, right, and trying to connect those boxes. So you are not selecting variables because they are convenient or commonly used, right, as some students usually argue, but you are selecting them because the theory tells you that these variables matter. So even when you are getting the what we call mediating variables or moderating variables or whatever they are, these must be derived, not because you want them. I've supervised many PhD students, by the way. Sometimes I argue a lot with the student. Student comes today, but for me, I do not argue a lot. If I tell you read this and pick this, and you don't want to do it, I leave you. You go right and do whatever you want. But after some time, I'll take you back. Right, so you may end up after doing all those things later on. You have to undo your work because your work must be theoretically grounded, right? And that is very important. I could give you an example again for you to put this into perspective. If, for example, you use resource-based view, then variables like farm capabilities, for example, and resources and the competences, these must be central. But if for you simply pick a variable like, say, I use the resource-based view, but you know resources as a variable was picked from the resource-based view, then competences again was picked from the competence theory by Boyaziz, 1980. Then you say that you know capabilities I picked from the dynamic capabilities theory, then you don't know what you are talking about. Because here you are saying that you have three theories, when actually one theory, the resource-based view, can give you these theories. So it's very important for you to think about this and reflect deeply about these particular variables that you are using and actually the theory that gives you these things. Generally speaking, again, if you say you are going to use institutional theory, then maybe some variables like regulatory structures, variables like norms and governance mechanisms must be present. Again, if you're going to use institutional theory, please think twice, right? Because within the institutional theory, you discover that if you are coming from Max Weber, there are certain constructs you'll have. If you are coming from North, right, again, in North also has another perspective of institutional theory. Then if you're talking about Scott, right, then you know the kinds of variables that you are talking about. So even when you're talking about institutional theory, again, be clear right from the word go. And that's why I said that you don't bring these boxes together because of convenience or because you think that's what these things are. You must reflect on the constructs that you are studying. So if your variables are not clearly linked to theory, ladies and gentlemen, then your conceptual framework becomes a collection of disconnected elements. And of course, a source of confusion at the end of the day. And that's why sometimes when, even after going to the field and collecting data, you start testing things mechanically and things do not seem to work out. And the examiners will see that immediately, right? So it's quite important for you to think about these requirements. And the third requirement that you see on the screen here is that relationships must be logically justified, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the third requirement. Third requirement tells you that relationships must be logically justified. And this is the most critical part and the most abused section of the conceptual and theoretical framework. Right now, I'm using the two terminologies concurrently, but we shall be drawing a distinction between these two as time goes on. Right. Again, when I come to theory, building, and of course, this doesn't come into philosophy of science. It comes in advanced research methods. That's when I try to draw a distinction between these. So students, again, as I said earlier on, often draw arrows between variables without explanation, right? X affects Y, M moderates the relation between X and Y. but they don't bring out the reason why, right? But why? I mean, that question must be answered. That why must come from one, theory, then two, must come from prior evidence, and then three, it must come from what I call logical reasoning, right? For example, if you argue that institutional quality influences, again, if I take the example that I gave you earlier, which was SME export performance. So you're saying institutional quality influences SME export performance, then you must explain, right, the how, right? So a number of questions will come out, right? For example, the first question might be, does regulatory consistency reduce uncertainty, for example? Or probably does enforcement improve compliance and market access? Or does networks compensate for weak institutions? So each relationship in this case must be argued, right? And that's why sometimes I ask my students after they have drawn their conceptual frameworks, right? I tell them that, well, can you represent that in a mathematical sort of model? Can you have a model? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to run a regression, you're going to collect data, you're going to run regressions, yeah, I mean, you are going to reduce that diagram into mathematical equations. So you must also have a theoretical explanation that comes from the methodology side. So you must have a theoretical model that will bring together all those particular aspects, right? Again, you will move from the philosophy, from theory now to methodology. So the equations must be there, right? You must reduce the diagram into, because those are the things you are going to test. You're not going to test the boxes that we see there. So your mind must move from there to another level. Do not simply assume those relationships, argue, all right? And it's always important, again, to give us your boundary conditions and to come up with the assumptions under which your diagram will actually work, or your theoretical model, conceptual model will work. Right, so I want to challenge you because this is an important area where rigor is actually required, right? So the challenge I want to leave with you, right, is that if your conceptual framework is drawn in a very short time, like most of you draw it, right, in 5 minutes you are done, right, without deep thinking, then think twice. It means that your conceptual framework is very, very weak, right? That's a possibility. Or two, it is not grounded in theory. Or probably three, it will not withstand the test that you are going to carry out. So again, as you can see, this is very important because a strong conceptual framework, ladies and gentlemen, theoretical and conceptual framework should, right, ordinarily reflect your understanding of the problem, your engagement with theory, right, your critique of existing knowledge and literature, and your proposed explanation. It is not an illustration, right? It is a model of your argument about reality, and that is how you think that reality exists out there. And for some of you who are going to take a realist, right, a philosophical orientation, I usually also encourage students who use that to start from the field, right? You extract reality out there, then you use the kinds of models we are using in management science to reduce, right, that reality into some kind of diagrams, right, that I call mental models, right? And then after coming up with those particular mental models and diagrams, then later on you turn them into some kind of theoretical models and conceptual models, right? But then the mental models are reduced into what we call mind maps. And once you use the what Golden and Biddle and Lack actually calls what we call theorize the storyline, I think I talked about them last week and the other week, and then you are ready to move to another level. So it's not an illustration, right? And it's not just a diagram drawn carelessly. It's a model of your argument about reality. So as you develop this section, ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself, do I clearly understand what each variable means? Can I trace each variable back to a theoretical foundation? Can I defend every relationship that I have drawn, right? And this is important because at this stage, you are no longer describing or critiquing, but you are constructing your own explanation of the world. Again, that's why philosophy matters. If you are constructing your own explanation of the world, then you are talking about the ontological and epistemological perspectives of your work. And that is what defines doctoral work, ladies and gentlemen. If your conceptual framework is strong, the rest of your study, the methods, the data, the analysis will follow logically. And you should never allow these examiners to begin dismissing, right, and removing a few things from your conceptual model. Because the moment they remove one aspect and the second aspect, then your model collapses. And when it collapses, then that means your philosophy collapses and your theoretic explanations also collapse, right? And you'll have a problem, right? So if it is weak, everything else will be unstable. So take this section, ladies and gentlemen, seriously. It is where your thinking becomes visible, ladies and gentlemen. So think about that. Think about it that way, right? Because that is your theoretical framework, our conceptual framework, right? Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to give you an example, right? To explain some of the things that may constitute your conceptual framework. Again, this is a very simple explanation as you see it, right? Where you tell us that maybe export performance is conceptualized as an outcome. May I ask someone that side who is able to see this and is very good at reading to read for us this example? Any volunteer, ladies and gentlemen?
Export performance is conceptualized as an outcome generated through the interaction of firm capabilities, institutional conditions, and network relationships. These constructs are not merely observable variables, but represent underlying mechanisms that influence firm behavior and outcomes.
Right. And as you can see, this can actually be reduced down to a diagram and also a series of equations if you want. So this slide that you see here shows you what a properly articulated conceptual framework looks like. Of course, when it is expressed as an argument about reality and not just a diagram. And if you can understand this very well, then you can know that even then someone can come up with a statement to represent a conceptual diagram, right? I remember attending some presentations, right, where people were arguing. You know, sometimes we also expose ignorance, right? Someone who has a diagram, right, and then you say that is not a theoretical conceptual model because you come from a different school, right, of thought. Another person who comes from a purely mathematical background will come up with a series of equations. And when he sees you with a diagram, he will say that is not a conceptual diagram, so a theoretical model or conceptual model, because you have not presented it in a series of equations. And to me, that is absolute nonsense. We just have to understand that a statement like that one there can be a conceptual framework. You can reduce it into a diagram. You can also put it into a series of equations. So that's why it's very important for us to know that a conceptual framework can be clearly articulated, right, and expressed as an argument about reality, not just a diagram. And this is where many candidates either demonstrate maturity or expose shallow thinking, right? So I will attempt to go through these sentences one by one so that we understand it. So, and I will go through it carefully. So as you can see, the beginning, export performance is conceptualized as an outcome generated through the interaction of firm capabilities, institutional conditions, and network relations. This is a very strong opening, as you can see, because it does something most students fail to do, right? It defines the dependent variable conceptually, not just operationally, right? And that's very important. Export performance in this case is not treated as a simple metric like export volume or revenue, but instead it is framed as an outcome of interacting forces. So the word interaction in this statement, right, is actually critical because it tells us immediately that no single factor explains performance. And it's also telling you that the outcome emerges from the combined effect of multiple dimensions of reality, right? So, for example, if one now goes ahead and introduces the constructs that I talked about earlier on, like firm capabilities, institutional conditions, right? And I'm sure in one way or the other, you see them in that sentence. So someone will go ahead, right, and bring those three constructs: firm capabilities, institutional conditions, and network relationships. So this is not random, as you can see, but is theoretically grounded. You can already see the integration of the resource-based view, right? Even if you want to take the institutional theory, by the way, you see it coming up. If you want to bring in network theory, those aspects also come up because you are talking about relationships. But here, as I said earlier on, you need to be very careful not to begin combining so many theories because you have firm capabilities and you believe that is a resource-based view, and then you have institutional theory, you are saying that is for institutional conditions, then, right. Because I didn't think about this critically, right? But let's imagine that is also correct, maybe at this level, but later on, I think I've been discouraging you from doing so. So at this case, or in this case, you see that these have a foundation and they have a source where they are coming from. So what the framework is doing in this case, as you see in that sentence, is to bring together different theoretical perspectives into a unified explanation. And that is exactly what your literature review should have prepared you to do, right? These things are derived from a critical review of theories and a critical review of empirical literature. So if you see, the statement now continues, right, in the slide here, that these constructs are not merely observable variables, right? But represent. But if you see that part, these constructs are not merely observable variables. This is where the argument now deepens, and this is where many students miss the point. Variables are often treated as measurable items, things you collect data on. But here the framework is saying these are not just variables, but they are conceptual constructs. And that's why when you look at the conceptual model, that's why we use the word theoretical stroke conceptual model. So in many cases, you will find the constructs there, right? Because they are underlying explanations, right? So when we begin now conceptualizing, operationalizing, and measuring, that's where we bring in those deeper aspects, right, of constructs then, or probably variables. So that's why the statement simply is telling you, or the example here is telling you, that these are not treated as measurable items, right? Those things that you collect data on, but the framework is saying these are not just variables, they are conceptual constructs. That means they represent something deeper than what is directly observed. For example, institutional conditions, right? If you take that, it's not just a survey score. It reflects a number of things like governance structures, like regulatory consistency, and enforcement practices. Again, when you look at network relationships, right, it's not just a number of contacts, but it reflects a deeper explanations, information flows, for example, access to opportunities. There are other aspects like trust and so forth. So you are being reminded here that do not reduce your framework to surface level indicators, right? Of course, after that, then comes the most important part where we say, but it represents underlying mechanisms that influence farm behavior and outcome. And this is the defining feature of a strong conceptual framework. You are not just identifying relationships, you are proposing mechanisms. And the mechanism answers the question, how does X actually influence Y? Right. So at some stage, when you introduce now mediators, that will be the mechanism through which, for example, X will influence Y. Right. So, and there's so many other examples. Farm capabilities influence export performance through, for example, improved product quality, and that's the mediator. Right. And of course, also innovation and efficiency. Institutional conditions may also influence performance by, of course, reducing uncertainties, shaping compliance, and so forth. So I think, as you can see here, your framework is no longer descriptive. It is explanatory in nature. And that is the standard that we need at the PhD level, ladies and gentlemen. So again, I'm simply saying that if your conceptual framework only says X influences Y, then you are still at a basic level. But if your framework says X influences Y through specific underlying mechanisms that, which of course operate within a particular context, then you are doing doctoral work. So it is always very important. Of course, I know a very good conceptual framework must be parsimonious. Again, those are things that we shall cover in advanced research methods. I'm very familiar with all those things, right? But you should know the level at which you are operating, because even some of the things that you are going to, that you may end up testing have been tested in literature already, meaning that you will not be contributing new knowledge at all. If you are simply saying X influences Y, and then you begin saying that, or maybe you go and collect data, then you test it, then you find it, then you say my work agrees with the X. It also agrees with the Y. I mean, you are simply reciting your work, and there is no new knowledge that you have generated. And that's why it is very important for you to think about those things, because every relationship that you come up with here must be able to demonstrate new knowledge, right? And that's why the philosophy then, philosophy of methods or philosophy of science matters a lot in this case. So these are basic things that are very important. And that's why I'm saying that this section is where your intellectual position becomes concrete. You are no longer reviewing or critiquing, but you are simply proposing your own model of reality. And if it is tested over time and found to be true, then that will become a theory, ladies and gentlemen. And again, as I'll be telling you, for some of you have seen the model which was developed by Captain, for example, that was his PhD work, right? That eventually became a theory, right? There are so many other theories that we quote today that were actually PhD pieces of some students at some stage. But now these are taken as theories, right? So it's very important for us to know. Again, I'll be giving you examples of those when we start interrogating that particular component of theory in advanced research methods, but not in philosophy of science. So that's why it is very important, ladies and gentlemen, to know that at this stage, you are proposing your own model of reality that has come from a critique of theories and a critique of empirical literature. And if that model is clear and is coherent and defensible, then the rest of your study, your methods, your data, your analysis will follow naturally. And that's where the examiners will say, wow, this is fantastic. If it is very weak, everything else will struggle and you'll be struggling through, and you'll be blaming your examiners, your doctoral committee members, and everybody. And you say, I even made a mistake to come and do a PhD from MOOCs. These people are very malicious. Remember, as I said earlier on, these are guardians of knowledge. They are custodians of knowledge. They cannot let down the bars so that every rubbish goes through. So take this example seriously. It is not just showing you what to write. It is showing you how to think at doctoral level and then move right systematically so that you come up with a very important section of your PhD work, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to move to the research questions. Again, these research questions, if you look at the structure that Makerere gives you, they come slightly earlier where you have the objectives, right? After the objectives, you have of course, you have the purpose of the study, the objectives, the research questions, the research hypothesis, and things like that, right? But generally speaking, after you have done a proper review of literature, right, and within that section, you develop a theoretical model and conceptual model. Actually, it's developed in the literature review. If you think you are going to draw it anyhow, and then you begin now fitting the literature to match your diagram, you are finished. Right. Whereas Makerere University asks you to present it differently, the actual reality is that you begin with a review of literature, and then after doing that, and even the hypothesis is actually derived within the literature review, and even your research questions and hypothesis. So that's why now I present the research questions after the theoretical or conceptual model. So you must align your questions with epistemology. Right, and that is very important. So, of course, here we are getting into a section that looks a little bit simple, but in reality, ladies and gentlemen, this section exposes whether your entire proposal is intellectually coherent or not. So, research questions are very important at this level. And this slide, as you see it, makes a very direct and non-negotiable point. Right. Of course, which states that your research questions must align with your epistemology. In other words, the kind of questions that you ask must be consistent with how you believe knowledge can be generated. Right. How you, of course, the other one will be the nature of reality that you have already defined. Right. And that's a kind of question you are going to ask, right? And that question is consistent with the nature of reality, right? That you have already generated. It's consistent with how you believe your knowledge will be generated. And it's consistent with the type of explanations that your study is aiming to produce. Now, if there is a mismatch here, your proposal becomes internally inconsistent. And the examiners will detect this element. Right. Can you help me and again mute those mics that seem to be misbehaving? So let me try to unpack this as I was trying to explain before we are interrupted by the mics that are misbehaving. So in this slide, ladies and gentlemen, we are distinguishing between types of questions, right? And the first is the what, or even how many questions, and this is a positivistic orientation, right? So the how many issue, of course, those are questions you can raise, right? How many, for example, individuals, right, phenomenon or things like that, right? These may actually come up, right? And these are types of questions. The what, right? What am I studying? What phenomenon? Can I describe it? Or the how many, right? If, for example, you go quantitative, right, and you are dealing with the issues of GDP, right? You are dealing with the financial statements. You are dealing with, of course, you are dealing with the issue of countable things, right? And those are issues that go with positivistic perspective, as opposed to the why, right, and the how, where you take on the critical realist perspective or the interpretive perspective, right? So these are questions, again, that focus on much deeper issues that you must think about. That is measurement, issues of quantification, issues of relationships between variables. For example, if you have a question, what factors influence export performance, right? If it is the what factors, then you know where you are coming from. Right. If you are asking a question, how many SMEs have access to export markets, for example, right? All those are issues that are very important. Or if you're asking what is the relationship between capital access and export performance. So these questions assume that reality is observable. It assumes that reality is measurable. And it assumes that reality can be analyzed through statistical relationships. So, of course, there's nothing wrong with this, ladies and gentlemen, but it is limited to a particular epistemological position. And that's why I told you that your conceptual theoretical framework will bring up these aspects. Before you begin thinking about mixed methods, right, look at your conceptual framework and how it is framed and see whether it favors mixed methods. If it is a critical realism, look at how your conceptual framework looks like, right, and then take up that perspective. So that's why philosophy is at the core of everything that you are doing. And that's why I'm saying that is very, very, very important, ladies and gentlemen. Now, of course, the second type that we saw there is the why or the how questions. And you can actually see that bullet there. And of course, that can take you can take you into critical realist or interpretive orientation, right? So the questions here go deeper. They are concerned with explanation. They are concerned with the mechanisms, right, that you can discover. I know even in the quantitative studies or positivistic philosophical orientation, you can look at mechanisms. But of course, it depends on what you are looking at. If it is mediation, then that can be a mechanism, right, through which a certain relationship can be explained. And that is a mathematical and quantitative and positivistic in nature. But if the mechanisms are qualitative, right, in nature, or maybe you're looking at processes, then you go into anti-positivistic perspective. And I can give you examples here. For example, you want to, you come up with a research question at the surface, the way we had thought earlier on, and that we must uncover the underlying mechanisms and contextual dynamics. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, where I lost you, because I can see that in one way or the other, I think I lost network, right? Where did I lose you, ladies and gentlemen?
We lost you, Prof, when you were talking about the why questions, which need deeper understanding.
Okay, that's fantastic, right? But you can hear me that side, right? The why, I think I explained that, and the how, right? Institutional mechanisms. I don't know whether I'm still recording or my recording has also disappeared. Right. Does it show there that I'm recording, or I need to?
Yes.
Activate?
The recording is there.
Fine. Because I need to send you that recording later on and again reflect on some of those particular issues that we have been discussing. Right. I think again, that is because of the buffering of the network, and this will always occur or happen. I hope next week when we are conducting our training for advanced research methods, we shall not have those, of course, inconveniences in the process.
Amen.
Right. So again, as I was saying, the moment you begin asking those questions, why do SMEs fail to translate capabilities into export success? How do institutional conditions shape farm behavior and so forth? Then you assume that reality is not fully observable at the surface, and that we must uncover underlying mechanisms and contextual dynamics. Now, this is where, again, most students make a serious mistake. They tell you we have a mixed methods, but when you look at the objectives, they are largely quantitative. You look at the research questions and hypotheses, they are largely quantitative, and you begin asking yourself as to whether actually the qualitative was necessary. So those are questions that you must think about, right, as you design your proposals or your studies. So, of course, if you are going to use mixed methods, then mix these types of questions, right, so that you can actually justify. But don't mix anyhow, and then you begin talking, telling us that you are going to use a particular paradigm that doesn't actually apply. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, those are major issues that you have to think about. As I said earlier on, you cannot ask why at a deep explanatory level and then use methods which are designed only to measure surface level relationships, unless you justify that move very carefully. If you cannot, then you must avoid those particular questions. So again, ladies and gentlemen, right, think about these things seriously, right? I don't know whether I need to say much about this, right? But I think you get the issue here, right? The research question, again, by the way, let me make this statement before I continue, right? Because I know that this question will be asked and you have to think about it. I think during your doctoral presentations, again, watch out for a question that resembles, right, the one that I'm going to give you, right? People will ask, what is your research question, right? Or someone asks you, what are your research questions? Now, these two mean two different things. A research question is a major research question for your study, and that usually refers to the statement of the problem, right? While research questions, those are the, of course, those questions that seek answers, right? In other words, the major research question is broken down into those questions that must be answered in order to give you the major research question. And that is very important, right? So think about it, right? Because your research question is not an isolated statement. It is a direct extension of your conceptualization of reality, right? So this is where your rigor is, right? And that's why your research question should not be generic, should not be descriptive, right? Or probably disconnected from your conceptual framework. Otherwise, if it does, then you'll have an issue. So your research question then should reflect, as I said earlier on, your epistemological position. It must be aligned with your conceptual framework because that's the major research question that you seek out to answer, right? Which is a statement of the problem and should focus on explanation rather than mere description. So, of course, as you develop your research questions, now I'm talking about research questions, ask yourself, do my questions reflect how I believe knowledge can be generated?
Good evening, Professor.
Right.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Interrupt, then I'll have to skip that because my mind, I may not be able to recall where I stopped, but ask because you have already interrupted. Then
okay, thank you, sir.
I'll go to the next slide. Yes.
Okay. Due to the importance of what you have said, we are we are hoping that you can repeat what you have said, but maybe we can make a, like on a class arrangement, like on a separate level. Maybe we can arrange something separately for you.
I don't know what is the question you are asking, because I stopped.
What you have repeated, I was interrupted with what you have repeated. You were saying the difference between research question and questions. You're saying it's something which is critical for us. Maybe if you can give us an opportunity to ask you questions later on how to answer those questions, then we can arrange it with the class president. Thank you.
Okay, but even then, ever after lecture, I mean, even during the lecture, I pause a bit at some stage, and that's the time when you should actually ask questions. Even this, I think I will pause at some stage, either around 7, for you to ask questions, right? Which is okay. Unless at a particular point when I'm explaining, right, you want me to explain or provide much deeper explanations, then you can always
yes.
I have no problem with that. Right, but I was still talking about the types of questions, and also taking you to, I hope I remember, right. So I think it's an issue of research questions and research question. What you need to know at this stage now is that when we talk about a research question, we are referring to the major research question, which is actually more or less your statement of the problem. That is the entire PhD thesis, your central argument, right? And that is really what your research question is. So if someone ever asks you, what is your thesis, what is your research question, you should know where you're operating. But the research questions, those are now those questions that you usually have under this section, especially after the objectives. You have the purpose of the study, the objectives of the study, you have the research questions, and you have the hypothesis. And those research questions usually come from your objectives of the study, right? Again, when you add up all those research questions and even a hypothesis, if it is mixed methods, if it is only positivistic and it is a hypothesis, when you add up all the hypotheses, they should add up to the major research question. And that is your thesis or your central argument. Right, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
I can now go to the next slide, actually. Right, which is actually methodology, right? And if you recall last week, I think the other week, I told you, I don't know whether I can actually trace the slide. Allow me to take you back a bit. I hope I'll remember. This is slide 36. Just to show you a diagram that I may not have shown you. This is the one actually. Right. Are you seeing it clearly, that side?
Yes, Professor. Okay,
where we say that philosophy drives methods, right? Of course, this diagram is not very accurate, right? If you see problem philosophy, it's actually a problem, philosophy, methodology, then you put an arrow, methods. Actually, before you go to, okay, it is problem, philosophy, methodology, then another arrow, methods. Right. Right. You usually, of course, that section is always a chapter of methodology, but because of the way we present it, the students do not see the methods. They only see methodology and they look at it as at a broader level. And that's why sometimes you tell students that you are writing the methodology section, but the methodology must begin with the philosophy of science. Right, and then in philosophy of science, you go to research design. Right, but now the student will not give you the research design, right? Because he cannot see how the research design actually comes from philosophy. Then when we move down to methods, then the student gets confused. What's the difference between methodology and methods? Right, because we don't usually talk about methods separately. Just like in philosophy, someone will say you begin with the philosophy. But if someone does not break down philosophy and show you the order, ontology, epistemology, axiology, then you go to methodology. You may actually miss it at that level. Right, and even then, you know, these are general branches, but from the ontology and epistemology and axiology, you'll be able to know that now this is pragmatism. This is critical realism. This is positivism. This is positivism. And then this is this and the other, right? So unless you really follow these things very well, you may actually lose it. So, and sometimes students will be asking you that, you know, now I've presented these ontological assumptions. Why do I have to talk about critical realism? Then the fellow gets confused at that level. Right, but I'll be talking about this and we continue to do so because we are dealing with the philosophy of science. So allow me to go to this slide of methodology, right? And within the methodology, again, you can see we've put dash philosophy, and within, and after philosophy, you can actually open your brackets, right? And maybe add ontology and epistemology in action, right? And not only epistemology, but you can add ontology, epistemology, and axiology in action. So of course, here we are entering a section where many doctoral candidates become either overly technical and they begin reproducing textbook material, or overly abstract, and when you read it, you do not even understand what they are writing. And of course, both are mistakes, right? If the work is overly technical and overly abstract, right, then you have not understood what you are doing. So this slide, ladies and gentlemen, is grounding you in something essential, right? And it is simply telling you that methodology begins with the philosophy and not with methods. So don't begin with methods, right? But begin with philosophy. So before you talk about your surveys, before you talk about your interviews, before you talk about your regression models, before you talk about your case studies, you must be clear about two things. One, what kind of reality you believe exists out there, right? And that is really describing your ontological positions. What kind of knowledge about that reality is possible? And that is your epistemology. If these are not clear, your methodology then becomes mechanical and unconvincing, right? So let me now try to unpack some of these, because I know I've been using ontology and epistemology all the time, because even in the statement of the problem, I talked about your ontology and epistemology, right? Even the conceptual framework, I've been talking about these things, right? So meaning that these things permeate throughout your entire thesis, right from your topic up to the end. So as I said, if these ones are not clear, then you are mechanical. So if you ever hear an examiner, doctoral committee member telling you are mechanical, right, then you know what you are what they are talking about. So that means they can't actually understand what you're talking about. So let me start with the ontological position, right, which I have been talking about, and it is actually on your first bullet, right? Here, right here in front of you, if you are in front of your laptop or your phone, right? So these are very, very important, and this is an important component, right? So when you take the ontological position, you are simply saying that reality, right, is probably stratified and mechanism based. So when the moment you mention that element of the stratification, that you know reality is not one, it's not singular, right? but it is stratified and mechanism based. And we can actually see it the way you stated your conceptual framework right from there, because your methodology comes after the conceptual framework. So the moment you bring out that aspect, then we see that this is a very specific and powerful claim. And this is often associated with the critical realism. The moment you say reality is not singular, reality is stratified and mechanism based, then critical realism philosophical orientation surfaces, ladies and gentlemen. So what does this mean? It means that reality is not flat. It operates at different layers. So at the surface, right, you have what is observable, right? For example, you have those issues of export volumes, right? You have farm revenues, you have market participation, but beneath these export volumes and farm revenues, there are deeper layers. Those deeper layers are institutional structures. Those deeper layers are power relations, right? Those layers are regulatory systems. Those layers could be informal networks. And even deeper still, there are mechanisms. And these mechanisms are the processes that generate the outcomes. For example, why do two farms, for example, with similar resources perform differently, right? For example, you have two companies. When you look at the resources they have, they all have resources maybe of around 1 trillion Uganda shillings or 1 billion Uganda shillings or 2 billion Uganda shillings, right? They are both more or less at the same level in terms of resources, but one is performing better than the other. So it's no longer a metric that matters here. There are other things that are done differently that you must unearth in this case, right? For example, why do policy interventions produce different outcomes in a different context? So you have a policy intervention, right, that is conducted in the private sector, right? The same policy intervention in the public sector producing different results. Maybe that is understandable because you are operating at two different levels, but you can imagine you have two developing countries, Kenya and Uganda, right? The same policy produces miracles in Kenya. When you bring it in Uganda here, you are in trouble. Just like I've always overheard people say that Uganda is very good at having laws, very good laws and policies, but unfortunately, we don't get anything out of it. But then they begin singling out Rwanda. They say that Rwanda simply copies these things. I'm not even very sure whether their claims are very correct, that they copy these things or they copy them from Uganda, right? And they're experiencing miracles. They are more or less in the heavens there, right? So people may wonder why. Because when you look at these two countries, maybe Rwanda doesn't even have as much resources as we do, right? But they are doing very well. For us with the resources and so forth, and the same policies, we are not doing very well. So the answer is not always visible in the data, right? So the positivistic perspective may actually miss it. Right, the answer may actually lie in the underlying mechanisms, how structures and actors interact over time. So when you adapt this ontological position, you are saying, my study is not just about what we can observe, it is about uncovering what generates what we observe. And that is a much deeper level of inquiry. And of course, this is very, very important. Of course, if we take the perspective of Karl Popper, I want to take you back to Karl Popper, right? And that takes us to the fourth bullet that you see there, right? Karl Popper simply says knowledge is fallible and conjectural, right? And of course, this is equally important and is often misunderstood. It means that knowledge is not absolute, so you cannot place it in numbers, and it is not final, right? I mean, and this knowledge is always often, right, and always knowledge is open to revision. So according to Karl Popper, we do not prove knowledge, we test it, we challenge it, and we attempt to falsify it. So in your study, you are not claiming that this is not the final truth about SME export performance. Instead, you are saying this is a well-reasoned explanation based on available evidence, but it remains open to critique and refinement. And that's why you are talking about the underlying mechanisms, right? You are not falsifying the positivistic position, but you're saying, yes, it is there, but it's tentative. So let us now discover the underlying mechanisms. And this has major implications for your methodology. It means that one, you must design your study in a way that allows for critical testing of your assumptions. It means that two, you must be transparent about limitations. And it means that three, you must avoid overstating your conclusions. So, of course, this is very, very, very important, right? So that's why everything must align, right from the time when you start thinking about your problem up to the time when you come to this level. So if you have already argued, for example, initially, that reality is complex and layered, and we can see it in the introduction, the way you write, you don't reproduce the same sentences and the same words, right? But you'll be emphasizing that point, and that will be a theme, that will be a thread that runs through your work. Reality is complex and layered, right? You are also saying that outcomes are driven by interacting mechanisms, and you are saying that existing knowledge is incomplete. Then your philosophical position here must reflect that perspective, and your methods must follow, right? If your reality is stratified, as we have already said, you cannot rely on only surface level data. That, you know, I went to Wobos, they have this data. I went to Bank of Uganda, this data, right? And that's why, again, you must be very careful at the PhD after getting your PhD. Don't do not begin judging fellows who are using qualitative methodologies and saying that they are wrong. Even the fellows who are telling a story, you even begin laughing and you say, storytelling at this level, it is wrong. Who tells you? I mean, go to garage computing, for example, they use stories. There are those old stories of productivity, for example, right? Our forefathers and grandfathers and so forth used to tell stories when they sat around a fireplace in the evening, right? As they are warming themselves, then you begin listening to stories, right? Those stories are very important. They carry meaning. If you are going to design, right, for example, productivity kind of methodology, and you are into what we call garage computing, and you are going to come up with a framework, right, upon which the productivity will be improved, you are going to use stories, right? Storytelling is the order of the day. Again, if you are looking at those fellows from the area of literature and so forth, even business, incidentally, if you use those stories very well and you conceptualize and theorize the stories, you can also come up with a very nice study, incidentally, if you know how to use storytelling. In the future, possibly, if we get sufficient time, right, I can't take you through this, but again, it will depend on GRC, what they want me to cover. Usually, I know they give us around 1 month. For example, now they will be saying, but Ntai, why aren't you completing this? Because you are supposed to cover this in 4 weeks, right? What are you still covering, right? So meaning that if we have already met around 3 weeks, actually my time should be up. And for me, at any given time, when they stop me, I will stop, whether I'm through or not, because that is the timing, right? So what I've done for you is to go into depth of these things. Otherwise, we don't usually go through them. And again, you will see when we start presenting these things next week, you will see we shall be passing on the surface, right? And maybe we do. Some of you are complaining that I'm giving you too many books, and you're asking, how do you read these books? You'll see at Makere, we shall not give you any single book. You have to go and look for them and buy them yourself, right? So instead of asking me how to read those books, just appreciate that they're even there because they may not be there, right? So those are the issues that we are talking about, right? Knowledge, right? reality is stratified, right? Meaning that you can't rely on quantitative, whether panel or time series data, right? But you have to then examine the underlying mechanism, meaning that you must design your study to uncover processes, not just relationships, right? So if you hear people complaining that this person said objective one, examine the relation between this, and number two, examine the relation between, then they say, but that's not a PhD, right? Those fellows are right. So you must think deeper than that. So according to Popper, if knowledge is fallible, you must allow room for alternative explanations. Alternative explanations are very important. So of course, I want to challenge you at this time, right? Because this is an area where most PhD proposals, right, become inconsistent. If you claim reality is complex and mechanism-based, but then use only a simple cross-sectional regression model without justification, then your methodology contradicts your philosophy, ladies and gentlemen. And that is a serious weakness. Your philosophical position is not decorative, right? You are not decorating your proposal with those things. It is directive. It tells the reader what kind of study you are conducting. It tells the reader what kind of evidence you consider valid. And it tells the reader how your findings should be interpreted. So as you develop your methodology, ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself, does my ontological position reflect the complexity I have argued? Right from the introduction, right? Does my epistemological stance, for example, align with how I intend to generate knowledge? Do my methods follow logically from these positions? Right, and these are very pertinent questions because at PhD level, ladies and gentlemen, methodology is not about tools. It's about coherence between philosophy, the problem, and the method. If that coherence is strong, your study stands on solid ground, just like the Christians usually sing, right? That I'm standing on a solid ground. Yeah? So no other thing can actually shake you up, right? So if it is weak, right, even the sophisticated methods will not save it. I've seen students coming up with the sophisticated methods, sophisticated data analytical tools, right? But the philosophy is horrible right from the introduction to the end. So these things, if they're not properly aligned, then ladies and gentlemen, you will be in trouble, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to move to the next slide. And then I think at this time, if I'm not mistaken, I'll give you about 10 minutes, but allow me to first finalize this slide, right? Then we take 10 minutes. I hope we shall not come back to this thing tomorrow. Unfortunately, we must finish before 8 because this link will be used by other people, and I do not want us to go beyond 8. But nonetheless, my objective today was to finish these slides. I have maybe 5 more slides or 7 more slides, if I'm not mistaken, but they can't go beyond 7. But given the time that I spend on each slide, then we may, you never know, we may not actually finalize or complete this. But allow me to finish slide 37, right? As you can see there on the, so that we move to another level, right? That is the research approach. Again, later on, I'll be introducing you to the research onion. I gave you that book. Who has bothered to read it? The research onion? I want to hear from you. George Tombe, have you read that book? We usually use it for advanced research methods, but for you, I'm lucky that I've even given you those books. So next week, as we teach you, please make sure that you refer to those books.
Yes, good evening.
Yeah, I've read about it, but from Saunders, I don't know whether it's the same.
Fantastic, that is it. I have given you a book by Saunders, you have it already. Read it from cover to cover, ladies and gentlemen. Don't ask me how you're going to read it. right? Last week I welcomed you to the PhD class, right? So you got it right. Sounders, the research onion. The deeper you peel the research onion, the sweeter it becomes, right? And the most interesting. So that's why you start from the other side, and then we have the research approach. Again, I'm going to prepare for you notes, right, on the research onion, and I'll be sending them separately, maybe tomorrow. I don't know. He said, if I don't, but you need to look at them because next week some of those things will be covered. But for you, have an advantage. I'll send you the notes, right? In case I forget, remind me at least before Monday, either tomorrow or Sunday. The research approach. Here you are justifying how you build knowledge. It's actually a justification, right? So this section here, right? I know sometimes we make mistakes, right? But it looks very straightforward when you talk about research approach. And I'm sure as you are seeing it from there, it seems so to be very straightforward. But it actually determines how your study moves from theory to evidence and back to explanation. And that's why I talk about research approach. So how are you moving from theory to now evidence? Because you must collect evidence. Remember, as you are doing your PhD, you are more or less like these fellows, a judge that's supposed to make a judgment in courts of law. So in other words, at the PhD level, we don't make statements anyhow. That's why we move logically, right, from philosophy, from theory, conceptual framework, right? Now we go to methodology, right? And back to philosophy, right? Logic comes in there, right? And so forth. And that's why I told you at some stage we shall be looking at logic, right? And how we make arguments and how we argue actually. So whereas this looks straightforward, but how do we move from theory to evidence and back to explanation? Where we do not have sufficient evidence, we do not speak, you keep quiet. So if you have nothing to say, do not say it because you have nothing. Right, so you move from theory to evidence and back to explanation. And this slide, as you can see it, ladies and gentlemen, is very clear. You must justify your approach, but not just state it or even come up with a label. Justify it. And there are three main approaches that I have presented here on your slide, and each represents a different logic of inquiry. And we are going to start with a deductive approach, right? That is a research approach. Deductive approach, that is testing theory. A deductive approach starts with existing theory. You take what we call established concepts and relationships, and then you test whether they hold in your context. For example, ladies and gentlemen, you might take the resource-based view, RBV, and hypothesize, right, that, for example, farms with stronger capabilities will have better export performance. And that's an example we've been using every now and then. You then collect data, right? After collecting the data, you test the relationship statistically, right? And of course, this is good because this approach is powerful when the theory is well developed. And we know the resource-based view is well developed. When the variables are clearly defined, and we know that in this theory, variables are clearly defined. And we know that relationships are already established, right? So that's how you get, you take the deductive approach when you are testing theory. But I must warn you, ladies and gentlemen, that this has a limitation. It tends to focus on confirmation of the existing theory than actually discovery. It may tell you whether theory holds, but not necessarily why it fails or how reality deviates from the theoretical expectations. Because, and in fact, when you test those things, you'll say, contrarily to the resource-based view, in this theory, we come up with A, B, C, and for me, sometimes I pity students. You see, after this, they come up with their own models. They say, this is now the Tombe model at the end. This is the Nabwami model, the Okurutu model. After removing those variables in their thing, right? But they don't even interrogate why those things were not significant. And if you have a mixed method, you go ahead and interrogate, and you will build a much stronger model where you are able to contribute. But usually we say, well, the dominant paradigm was quantitative, and therefore this one does not hold. So my new model, Nabwami model, is this. Sometimes you look at them and laugh, right? But because it is widely acceptable, you say, well, let them go, right? But of course, remember, we are in the knowledge industry, so we are creating new knowledge. So, that's why the major weakness with this confirmation, especially the deductive, right, approach, right? But this is widely acceptable, right? And you go ahead. So the second approach, as you can see, is inductive. This is building theory. And theory building, for some of you have access to my material on my YouTube. Go and listen. I think I have about 10 lectures on theory building, right? 10 lectures, one after the other. You learn, right, how theory building is done, right? And those are very important aspects. I will not go into details, but this is the inductive approach. So this moves in the opposite direction, right? So it is opposed to deductive approach. You begin with the data, and this data is often qualitative. And from that data, you develop concepts and patterns, and eventually you come up with a theory. So for example, if we continue to use what we've been talking about here of export performance, for example, you might conduct interviews with the small and medium enterprise managers and then discover that informal networks play a much larger role than formal institutional support. And from this, you begin to build a new theoretical understanding, right? And when you do that, then you see the perspective that you are taking here is inductive in nature. And this approach is useful when there is a limited existing theory or the phenomenon is not well understood and you want to generate new insights. Again, let me make one major statement here, again, which will contradict some of the things that you have always heard. When you take the inductive approach, the theory building, right, route, you do not necessarily need a conceptual model. But you'll hear many colleagues of mine telling you, what is your conceptual model? It is you've not done it very well, right? But literature, right, is replete, right, with what should be done. So I may decide not to have anything and just have a story in the introduction. My work is not weak at all, right? Only that if you have not used it, you think that the other people's work are not good at all. So that is possible. And I do not even need a theory in the introduction of my work because I'm engaged in the theory building process. So that means that at the end of the day, my work must generate a theory. Why should I begin interrogating? Right. Now, if I want to use it, then you use the modified, right, inductive approach, again, which is modified grounded theory, then you use Shamas. So at that stage, you can bring theorem, right, in the introduction, but carefully, not to pollute your entire study, right? All right. So again, here balance, because at the end of the day, the panel, because not all of us think the same way, right? And not all of us are educated in these schools of thoughts. We take one perspective, right? Just like, which example can I use? I think it's an example of an elephant. You've heard about the elephant, where blind people went to touch. They said they went to see. Blind people went to see, but they were blind. How did they see? The blind people at least were comfortable with an elephant. One who simply touched the tail and said, "Me, I understand the elephant very well. It's like a snake," right? The other one, actually somehow touched the trunk and said, "No, I know. It's like this thing of a tree, the stump of a tree." Another one touched something else and said, "Well, I know it's like this and the other." That's exactly what is happening. And it happens usually during the Viva. And sometimes the students are even more knowledgeable, right, than some of us, right, when they are presenting their work, right? But you don't blame. I'm sure you still remember some of the statements I made. I cannot make them here because I'm recording. But of course, you know, when we meet physically, we discuss these things because we are not recording anything there. Right. So that is where we are, right? With inductive, that is the theory building perspective. Just a moment. Maybe you allow me, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we pause a little bit here? I know where I've stopped and I will begin from there right away. We have covered the deductive approach and the inductive approach. And it is right now, it is 7:16. Can we take 7 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes a break? Is that okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Let us relax for 7 to 10 minutes and then resume after 10 minutes or 7 minutes. Great, 7 to 10 minutes. Right, enjoy your break, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Prof.
Then we'll begin from there.
Break. Next week, bagenda tuvuga mara.
Rashid, you're online.
Can we begin from there, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes, Professor.
Yes, Prof.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I hope you've had an interesting break. And okay, let me see how I can share again my slides. What's happening here? Where is the other option? Okay, for share is here. Right. I am not very sure, right, whether we'll be able to cover all the slides. To me, I think we should not actually rush, but try to understand what we are covering, right? So I think we'll try our level best. If we don't cover this evening, then we shall cover maybe the remaining 5 slides tomorrow morning, and then we can have a general discussion. Maybe you have questions, you have issues that you want to raise, right? So why don't I just complete these slides, and then we have questions from you, and then if I have answers, then I can respond. If any one of you has answers, then he can provide the answers. And then can someone help me to mute that person? Then we can resume very early in the morning. We are meeting at 8. And again, I want us to meet for around 1 hour or 2 hours maximum. So we should not go beyond 9 or 10, right? Either 2 hours or 1 hour. And then we can have questions as well, and that will be the end. Then the other issues will be covered next week, as now we go into deeper philosophical perspectives. So right, as I told you on this slide, we must justify our research approach, which can be deductive in nature, testing theory, inductive, that is theory building, right? And of course, we have the third one, which is abductive, right? And again, the choice is yours, ladies and gentlemen. I think we had more or less covered the theory building bit, right? Again, depending on where you are coming from, whether it is mixed methods or it is positivistic, right? Or phenomenology. Again, as we shall get into those philosophical orientation, we shall see the different types of philosophies that you can adopt. So that if you find someone is talking about grounded theory, another one is talking about modified grounded theory, another one is talking about phenomenology, another is talking about critical realism, right? Again, you think twice before you start dismissing them, right? So that's why for every PhD student who presents, listen carefully and get to understand where the student is coming from, and be able to gauge, right, what the destination will be like. And then you ask appropriate questions. So, of course, the inductive approach also has weaknesses, right? Maybe I never talked about weaknesses of the inductive, right? Because again, if you are taking the inductive approach and you have case studies and you have used the case study methodology and the attendant philosophical orientation, it may also have limitations. It may lack generalizability. You cannot generalize from one case, a single case, or even multiple, even if there are about 5 or 6 or 10 cases. So generalizing becomes a little bit hard, and you may also try to struggle to connect your work to what we call established theoretical frameworks, right? And that can be a weakness. So every study has its own weaknesses and strengths. Right, the third approach, ladies and gentlemen, is the abductive approach, right? And I'm using the word best explanation there because it actually tries to deal with the weaknesses and the strengths of both of those. So in other words, one of them deals with the weakness of the other, and the other one deals with the weakness of the other. So in other words, abductive is very useful here, right? So this is where doctoral work usually becomes very, very powerful, but you must know what you are going into, right? And also work very, very hard. So when you talk about abduction, it's not very, very simple as many times we think that it's simply a middle ground between deduction and induction, or deductive and inductive. It's not just that way. It's not as simple as getting a middle ground, right? It is a dynamic interplay. And when you talk about dynamic interplay between theory and evidence, we know exactly what you are talking about. So in other words, you begin with an observed problem, right? Something that does not fully make sense given existing theory. Then you move back and forth. You use the theory to interpret the data. You use the data to refine or challenge the theory. And of course, at this stage, you are constantly asking the question, what is the most plausible explanation for what I am observing, right? For example, again, taking what we've been discussing here, if you observe that small and medium enterprises in Uganda have access to resources, right? But even despite the access to the resources, they still underperform in exports. And then you interrogate the theory, you discover that existing theory cannot fully explain this. So what you do, you explore. For example, you begin asking yourself, could institutional constraints be interfering? Could the network inefficiencies be limiting market access? Or could informal practices be shaping outcomes? So at this level, you then begin thinking beyond what theory says, and then you refine your explanation by integrating insights from multiple theories and empirical observations. And of course, this is exactly what we are trying to advocate for in this slide when we talk about abductive, right, approach. So in other words, you say that the study, as you can see down there, the second bullet, that the study adopts an abductive approach integrating theory and evidence. And of course, this is considered to be strong because, one, it reflects the complexity established earlier, and this is something that we already know. Two, it also allows for explanation, not just measurement. That I conceptualized, operationalized, then measured, right? And then after that, I conducted the robust validity and reliability using sophisticated statistics. And then I also tested for multicollinearity. I also did this and the other. Yes, those are very important because we want to reduce bias in research, and you must do them. Right? But I mean, at this level, you see there's a complexity in this. You are able to come up with explanations, not just relying on measurements alone. And then this, I mean, what you've come up with now aligns with a reality that is mechanism-based and context-sensitive. So you are able to establish those nitty-gritties and the complexities of nature, right? So, and this is very important. And ladies and gentlemen, if you are going to use this, please, one, identify gaps in existing theory, right? Then two, make sure that you argue that reality is complex and layered if you want to use this. But you also tell us that your study seeks to uncover underlying mechanisms, right? So if you have a situation of that nature, then a purely deductive approach that you see there, which is the testing theory, is too restrictive. And a purely inductive approach, right, where you test a theory, or sorry, you build a theory, may also disconnect you, right, from existing knowledge. And that's why you must ask yourself, am I simply testing theory? Am I trying to explain something that theory does not fully capture? Do I need flexibility to move between data and theory? If the answer is yes, then an abductive approach is often the most defensible in this case. But ladies and gentlemen, this is important. If you decide to take this kind of framework, then you must justify it clearly. Do not just say this study uses an abductive approach, right? Explain why deduction alone is insufficient, and why induction alone is insufficient, and why abduction allows you to try and better explain your research problem, right? And you have to do so because at PhD you must defend every word. I remember when I was still doing my PhD, my supervisors told me that if you write down a sentence and you cannot defend it, then again, get rid of it. If there's a word you can't defend, get rid of it. They told me that only write things that you can defend, because this is a thesis and you must be able to defend every word, every sentence, every comma, every letter, right? Because at PhD level, your research approach is just not a label. It is a logical bridge between your philosophical position and your methods. Right. If that bridge is strong, ladies and gentlemen, your study will stand. If it is weak, everything else will become fragmented. So take this seriously. And this is where your studies reasoning becomes fully visible. And ladies and gentlemen, allow me to stop there and pause. If you have any question, you ask. And then we shall start from there tomorrow, right? Otherwise, we should be moving towards the close. So let me give you an opportunity to ask questions, and then thereafter, right, ladies and gentlemen, we shall be able to close. Yes, I can see a hand being raised by our friend Tombe. Please go ahead and ask your question, sir. Hello? Are you hearing me?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Yes, thank you so much. This is George. This is Tombe for you.
Please go on.
Yes, good evening, Professor, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you once again for mentioning my name in one of your comments. My one is not a question, it's just a comment.
Yes, sir.
I would like to thank you for the books which you have amply provided for us. You have amply provided for us. It will, I'm sure it will change our mindsets. This is my comment. I don't have a question right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. At least that encourages me to give you more books, not to withhold them. I remember
Amen, amen.
there's a scripture that people usually quote that Jesus healed so many lepers, many blind people, and the lame, but only one person remembered to go back and say thank you. So I appreciate your comment, sir. Any questions?
Yes, thank you.
Any other person? I see Diaz Okurut. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Professor. Mine is a simple comment, notwithstanding what George has said. I am of the same view also, but I would like to ask colleagues to let you go. After all, we have time tomorrow. Some of us are parked at the side of the road,
Okay.
just for parts of this lecture, which we didn't want to miss.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, ladies and gentlemen, okay, I see Vianney Mutiava. Let's take Vianney Mutiava and then we close so that I allow you to move. And then we meet tomorrow at 8 a.m. Vianney?
Thank you, Professor. I wanted to ask about next week's lectures at Makerere University. Are they continuous? How are they structured? For example, can I attend on Monday and I miss Tuesday and I attend Wednesday? Or if I miss the first 2 days, then it's relevant to even come for the rest of the days. Thank you.
Right. Now, as I told you, Mutiaba, maybe you came late. I said I'm not a spokesman for Makerere, and I'm not a spokesperson for MOOBS, and I cannot answer. Now, maybe one thing I should let you know is that at Makerere, the approach that we take is competency-based. You may have noticed that here the way I approach things is not necessarily competence-based. I spend most of the time talking, but later on we shall have activities. So for the Makerere, every after maybe 30 minutes or 1 hour, we give you an activity, right? And we start evaluating you, depending on what you speak and what you present. And sometimes we give you an exercise, just like the way they do it at all level activity of integration, so that you go and work on it and submit, and we score you. And at the end of the day, we give you marks. So the question of attending today and missing tomorrow, attending in the morning and miss afternoon, those are things that must be out of your program. If I were you, I would have asked for leave from my employer for after it's about 10 days, so that at some stage you don't miss out. Because you can imagine, I think the facilitators, people are going to facilitate, we are 10, if I'm not mistaken, or 9. But you'll find that some people will be taking more sessions than others. Some people may appear once or twice, while others will be consistent, appear for 3 days or 4 days or 5 days. And possibly there will be someone who appears throughout the entire session of 10 days. So meaning that they will continuously assess you, and you know what that means. Right. So as I said earlier on, please do not quote me. I am not a spokesperson for Makerere University. And those questions you are directing at me, I think you're a little bit unfair to ask me those questions relating to the program that is administered centrally at Makerere. I would suggest that you only ask me questions related to philosophy of methods. Those ones I'm able to answer currently. But the Makerere, don't ask me, even in MOOBS, don't ask me. You have deans there and heads of departments. The other side, you have a director and yes, and the deputy director they will answer those questions. You can reach out to Professor Chikoma's office, right, and other people. Right, have I answered your question, Vianney Mutiaba? I'm very sorry to respond that way, but that's the truth.
Thank you so much. You've answered it. Thank you.
I don't want to be held responsible for anything. So as for this, go to your dean, MUBS, and that is Professor Sulaiti is the one in charge. He has everything. He will even tell you the stories of Makerere and how you relate with Makerere. So I do not want to say anything there because I am ignorant. I'm actually innocent. I don't know anything. Right. But for me, it was just a humble request that maybe you'll pick something from Makerere so you can attend. Right. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much for attending this lecture. Let us meet tomorrow morning at 8, maybe for 1 hour, and then we shall see how we resume next week. Of course, within the week, it will not be possible for me to run any because I know Makerere, I don't want to come up with the programs that conflict with the Makerere program. But I think over the weekend, because there are no lectures on Saturdays, the other side, so I can have a meeting for 1 hour. And if I find favor in your presence, your site, and so forth, we can also have 1 hour on a Sunday, depending on how free we are. Not in the morning, but after prayers, maybe in the evening. But we shall decide on that. Otherwise, it was nice having you this evening, and enjoy your day and your night. And I wish you sweet dreams. And
Thank you, Prof.
May God's angel protect you throughout the entire night. Bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you.
Wish you a good night.